In 1936, a Nebraska farmer built a tractor out of a wrecked Model T, a truck axle, and a weekend of welding. It cost him $11. The dealer in town wanted $1,200 for the shiny new one in the window. That homemade rig plowed 40 acres that fall and never quit. This is the story equipment companies spent decades hoping you would forget. Because for every gleaming machine in the showroom, some farmer with a torch and a junk pile had already built something that did the same job for pocket change. Number 14 saved so much money, a major manufacturer quietly copied it. And number 3 was so simple, grown men felt robbed when they saw how it worked. Hit subscribe before we start. These are 20 poor man farm machines that made expensive equipment look like a scam. Number 20, the barrel land roller flattened seedbeds across the plains long before a farmer ever wrote a check for a factory cultipacker. The idea was almost insultingly simple. Take an empty steel drum, weld a pipe axle through the center, build a wooden frame around it, then fill the barrel with water or wet sand until it weighed enough to crush every clod in the field. A new packing roller from the implement dealer ran $35 to $60 in the 1940s, a small fortune when corn sold for pennies a bushel. The homemade version cost whatever the barrel did, which was usually nothing. Hitched behind a team of horses, it rolled the ground smooth and firm so seeds sat snug against the soil. Farmers emptied the water each winter so it would not rust or freeze solid, then filled it again come spring. It left the field looking as if a giant thumb had pressed it flat, and nobody who owned one ever understood why the store version cost $60. Number 19. Before spring-tooth harrows hung in every hardware store, farmers dragged their fields smooth with nothing but a bundle of brush and a chain. A young man would cut a thick tangle of thorn branches or a small felled tree, weight it down with a fence rail or a couple of rocks, and hitch the whole shaggy mess behind the horses. Dragged across plowed ground, the brush leveled ridges, broke up clods, and scratched the soil into a fine seedbed. A manufactured harrow cost anywhere from $15 to $40, and the fancy spike-tooth models cost more. The brush drag cost a morning with an axe. When the branches wore down to nubs after a season, the farmer simply cut fresh ones and started over. It was the kind of tool that made a man wonder what exactly he was paying for at the implement dealer. Oral histories from the Midwest recall boys riding the drag for extra weight, laughing as it bounced across the furrows, doing the work of a machine that cost a month's wages. Number 18. Every farm carved out of rocky ground needed a way to move the rocks, and the stone boat answered without a single moving part. It was a flat wooden sled, sometimes just heavy planks, bolted to 2 curved runners, low enough that a man could roll a boulder onto it without lifting. Dragged behind horses or later a tractor, it slid across the field, gathering the stones that frost pushed up every spring. A proper wagon rode too high to load heavy rock by hand and cost real money. The stone boat cost a few boards and an afternoon. In New England and the upper Midwest, clearing stones was endless work, and the boat made it bearable. Farmers used it for everything: hauling feed sacks, moving fence posts, dragging a downed calf out of the pasture. It left 2 smooth tracks in the dirt, like the trail of something heavy and patient. Long after tractors arrived, old-timers still kept a stone boat in the barn, because nothing store-bought ever loaded quite so low or cost quite so little. Number 17. Stripping kernels off the cob by hand blistered a family's thumbs raw through the long winter until the hand-crank corn sheller turned the chore into a game. A cast-iron version from Sears cost a couple of dollars, but plenty of farmers built their own from a wooden box, a toothed wheel, and a crank salvaged off a broken machine. You fed an ear into the hopper, turned the handle, and the spinning teeth ripped the kernels loose while the bare cob shot out the other end. What took an evening by hand now took minutes. Children fought over whose turn it was to crank, filling a bushel basket with a steady, golden rattle. The shelled corn went to the chickens and hogs, the cobs went to the stove, and nothing was wasted. Manufacturers sold 2 whole shellers for a stiff price, promising speed, but the homemade box did the same work for a family of 6. The sound of that crank turning on a January night, the clatter of kernels in the pail, meant the animals would eat, and so would everyone else. Number 16. Fencing a quarter section meant digging hundreds of holes, and the store-bought post-hole augers of the day were heavy, expensive, and prone to snapping. So farmers built a spring pole rig instead. They lashed a sharpened iron bar or a homemade digging spoon to a long, springy sapling anchored in the ground, so the pole did the lifting while the man did the driving. Bounce it down, twist, bounce it up, and the dirt came with it. A factory auger cost $8 to $12 and still wore a man out. The spring pole cost a young tree and some rope. On the plains, where a homestead claim required miles of fence to prove up the land, this was the difference between finishing and failing. The rhythmic creak of the pole, the thud of iron on clay, carried across the prairie all day long. It was slow, but it was free, and it built the fences that fenced the West. Farmers who later bought powered augers admitted the old spring pole never once left them stranded with a broken shaft in the middle of a field. Number 15. When a farmer needed concrete for a foundation, a water tank, or a hog trough, the last thing he wanted to buy was a mixing machine he might use twice a year. So he made one from a barrel. A steel drum was mounted on an axle inside a simple frame, sometimes with a hand crank, sometimes belted to a small engine or hooked to a hay pulley. Toss in sand, gravel, cement, and water, spin the barrel, and out came mortar as smooth as anything a mason could mix. A real cement mixer cost $40 or more in the 1930s, an absurd price for a job that came around a few times a season. The barrel version cost a drum and a Saturday. Whole dairy barns were poured a wheelbarrow at a time with these homemade rigs. The lazy tumble of gravel inside the turning drum, the gray slurry pouring out the open end, built silos and stanchions and cellar walls across the country. Farmers who watched a neighbor rent a real mixer just shook their heads at the money. Number 14. Separating good grain from chaff, dust, and weed seed was slow, filthy work until the fanning mill did it with a hand crank and a clever set of screens. Many farmers bought them, but the design was simple enough that a handy man built his own from wood, wire mesh, and a paddle wheel fan. You poured threshed grain in the top, cranked the handle, and the blast of air blew away the light chaff, while the shaking screens sorted the heavy seed by seed. Clean seed came out one spout, weed seed another, and the trash blew out the back. A good store fanning mill cost $25 to $50, and this is the one that rattled the manufacturers. As homemade and cooperative-built mills spread through farm country, at least one major seed cleaning company quietly redesigned and cheapened its machine to compete. Clean seed meant a better stand, fewer weeds, and a bigger crop, so the mill paid for itself in a single season. The whir of the fan, the hiss of grain over the screens, was the sound of a farmer keeping the money he used to hand the dealer. Number 13. Plucking a chicken by hand was a wet, tedious ritual that stole an hour from butchering day until farm families rigged up a plucker from a wash tub and a handful of rubber fingers. The clever ones mounted rubber pegs on a drum and spun it with an old electric motor or a hand drill, so a scalded bird pressed against the spinning fingers came out bare in seconds. Commercial pluckers, when they existed at all, cost more than a small flock was worth. The homemade rig cost a tub, some scrap rubber, and whatever motor was already lying in the shed. On butchering day, when a family might process 40 birds for the freezer, the machine turned an all-day backbreaker into an afternoon. Feathers flew like a snowstorm, and children shrieked and ducked as the drum flung them across the yard. What the store wanted to charge for a poultry plucker felt like a joke to a man who had built one from a bucket. The old grind of scald, pluck, and pin feather by thumb gave way to a rubber-fingered blur that never asked for a dime. Number 12. Heating a farmhouse through a hard winter meant splitting cords of wood, and a hydraulic splitter, when they finally came along, cost more than most farmers cleared in a month. So they built the screw splitter, sometimes called a spinner or a stickler. A heavy, tapered steel screw, often threaded on a lathe from a truck axle, was mounted on a shaft and spun by a belt off the tractor. Push a log against the turning cone, and the threads bit in, drew the wood forward, and burst it apart with a loud crack. A single man could split a whole winter's wood in a day. Store-bought splitting mauls were cheap, but they cost a strong back and long hours. The powered screw cost a length of steel and some ingenuity. It was not the safest machine on the farm, and men learned quick to keep loose sleeves well away from it. But the sight of a log splitting itself in half as fast as you could feed the pile made every ache-filled afternoon with an axe feel like a con. The wood stove had been running for years. Number 11. Before the chainsaw was common or affordable, the belt-driven buzz saw turned a tractor into a lumber mill. A big circular blade was mounted on a frame with a tilting table, and a long flat belt ran from the tractor's power pulley to spin it screaming fast. Feed a log or a fence rail into the whirling blade, and it cut clean through in a heartbeat. Neighbors gathered for a sawing bee, running a whole winter's stove wood through in an afternoon while the women cooked dinner. A dedicated sawmill cost a fortune, but nearly every farm already had a tractor with a belt pulley just waiting for a job. The saw itself was a blade and a frame a blacksmith could build. The howl of that spinning steel carried for a mile, and old men still tell of the cousin who lost a finger to it. Dangerous, deafening, and cheap, it did the work of machinery that would have swallowed a whole year's profit, using power the farmer had already paid for the day he bought the tractor. Number 10. Hauling loose hay to the stack used to mean pitching it onto a wagon by sweating fork until the buck rake swept it up whole. It was little more than a row of long wooden teeth mounted low on a frame, pushed ahead of a team, or bolted to the front of an old car or tractor. The driver ran it straight into a windrow, the teeth slid under the hay, and a whole haycock rode up onto the rake to be carried to the stack in one trip. A manufactured hay loader cost well over $100. The buck rake cost some lumber and a day's building. Out west, where a ranch might put up hundreds of tons of hay, this homemade sweep replaced whole crews of pitching men. The hay piled up faster than 3 strong backs could throw it, sliding along the ground in golden heaps. Ranchers who watched a neighbor buy an expensive loader and still hire a pitching crew just grinned and pushed another load to the stacker with a machine that had cost them almost nothing. Number 9. Hauling manure to the fields was the dirtiest job on the farm, and the factory spreaders that beat and flung it were among the priciest tools in the catalog, running well over $100. Plenty of farmers built their own from an old wagon box, chaining a wooden beater across the back and rigging it to turn off the wheels as the wagon rolled. As the team pulled forward, the wheels drove the beater, which chewed the load apart and slung it evenly across the ground. What used to be flung by hand, a forkful at a time, now spread itself while the farmer just drove. A homemade spreader cost a worn-out wagon and some chain, parts already rusting behind the barn. Well-spread manure meant richer soil and a heavier crop, so the machine paid its way every spring. The smell was unforgettable and the mechanism cranky, but it worked. Farmers who priced a new spreader in the dealer's book, then went home and built one from junk, learned early that the most expensive machines were often the easiest to fake. Number 8. Every farm ran on sharp edges, plow points, scythe blades, axes, sickles, and keeping them keen meant a grindstone. The store models mounted on fancy frames cost more than the job deserved, so farmers built their own from a salvaged stone wheel, a wooden frame, and a foot treadle scavenged off a broken sewing machine. Pump the treadle, and the heavy stone spun steady while both hands guided the blade against it, a trickle of water dripping from a tin can above to keep the edge from burning. A boy might spend a Sunday afternoon pumping while his father sharpened a season's worth of tools. The rhythmic squeak of the treadle and the singing hiss of steel on wet stone was the sound of a farm getting ready to work. A powered grinder cost real money and needed electricity most farms did not yet have. The treadle stone cost scrap and sweat. Farmers who kept theirs true sharpened blades keener than any store grinder managed, and never paid a cent for the privilege after the day they built it. Number 7. In the South and the border states, sweetening the pantry meant sorghum syrup, and boiling it down started with crushing the cane in a mill. Manufactured cane mills existed, but many communities built their own from heavy iron rollers salvaged and geared together, turned by a mule walking an endless circle at the end of a long sweep pole. Farmers fed cane stalks between the rollers, and the green juice ran out into a barrel to be boiled for hours over a wood fire into thick amber syrup. A whole neighborhood came together for the sorghum making, the mule plodding its slow ring, children chewing the sweet crushed stalks, the smell of boiling syrup hanging in the autumn air. A store-bought mill cost dearly and sat idle most of the year. The homemade one cost old gears and community labor, and it turned a field of cane into a winter's worth of sweetening. Long after sugar came cheap, families kept their cane mills because nothing bought in town ever tasted like syrup made on shares under the trees. Number 6. Moving grain up into a bin or a wagon meant scooping it by hand, one shovelful at a time, until the homemade auger carried it up on a turning screw. A metal spiral, sometimes forged, sometimes cobbled from an old drill flight, was set inside a wooden or pipe trough and cranked or belted to spin. Grain poured in the bottom, rode the screw straight up to the top, and spilled into the bin. A manufactured elevator cost a hard sum in the lean years, and this was pure back-saving magic for a fraction of it. What took a man an hour of shoveling now took minutes, and it never got tired or asked for a rest. Farmers belted them to a tractor pulley or a little gas engine and filled granaries faster than 3 men with scoops. The steady churn of grain climbing the screw, the golden stream pouring off the top, meant the harvest was safe in the bin. When dealers finally sold cheap augers, farmers who had already built their own just nodded, knowing they had beaten the price by 20 years. Number 5. An orchard full of apples was money on the ground unless a family could press it into cider, and store-bought presses cost more than the fruit was worth. So farmers built their own from a stout wooden frame, a car jack or a big threaded screw, and a slatted tub to hold the ground apples. Crush the apples in a homemade grinder, pile the pulp in the press, and crank the screw down until the sweet juice ran out in a steady amber stream. A family could put up barrels of cider and vinegar for winter from windfall apples that would otherwise have rotted. Manufactured presses ran $20 and up. The homemade one cost lumber and a junkyard jack. Cidermang was a whole autumn ritual, the family taking turns at the grinder, wasps circling the sweet-smelling pulp, jugs lining up full along the cellar steps. Farmers who tasted a neighbor's cider, pressed on a rig built from scrap, never once envied the man who had paid cash for a factory press that did the very same thing. Number 4. Out in the hay country of the northern plains, stacking loose hay 30 feet high used to mean impossible labor, until the beaver slide overshot stacker lifted whole loads into the sky. It was a tall wooden ramp with a basket that ran up rails, built entirely on the ranch from poles and cable, powered by a team of horses pulling a rope through a pulley. A buck rake dumped hay into the basket at the bottom. The horses pulled, and the load shot up the slide and tumbled over the town onto the growing stack. One of these homemade giants could build a stack that fed cattle through the deepest winter. There was no factory version worth buying because the beaver slide, invented on a Montana ranch, worked so well that ranchers built them by the thousands with nothing but native lumber and know-how. The creak of the rising basket and the whoosh of hay pouring over the top put up thousands of tons across the West. It was a machine so good and so cheap that the equipment companies never even bothered to compete. Number 3. Digging a field of potatoes by hand fork was brutal, bent back work, and the mechanical diggers in the catalog cost far more than a small grower could justify. So farmers built a simple one-row digger from a curved blade or an old plow bottom fitted with a row of trailing steel rods. Pulled behind a horse, the blade slid under the row, lifted the whole hill, and the rods let the dirt sift through while the potatoes rolled out clean on top of the ground, ready to pick. This was the entry that made grown men feel robbed, because when they saw how little steel it took to do the job, they could not believe what the store had wanted for the same thing. A factory digger cost dearly. The homemade version was a plow bottom and a welding job. Behind it walked the whole family, baskets in hand, gathering potatoes out of the loosened earth. The clatter of tubers tumbling free, the dark soil turned open to the sun, meant the cellar would be full. What the implement dealer sold as a marvel, a blacksmith built in an afternoon. Number 2. Water was life on the dry plains, and the companies that sold pumping windmills knew it, charging a stiff price for their galvanized towers and geared heads. But plenty of farmers built their own from scrap lumber, old wagon wheels, and salvaged pump rods, raising homemade wooden windmills that caught the endless prairie wind and pumped water for free day and night. Once it was up, it cost nothing. No fuel, no wages, no attention beyond a little grease, just the wind doing the work while the farmer slept. A manufactured steel windmill cost $100 or far more, a staggering sum on the homestead, while the homemade one cost a pile of boards and a few evenings of tinkering. The lonesome creak of the wheel turning through the night, the splash of water into the stock tank at dawn, meant cattle and family alike would drink. Whole regions were settled on the strength of homemade windmills. Nothing the dealer sold ever pumped a single drop cheaper than the wind a farmer harnessed himself, and every man with a homemade mill knew exactly what that steel tower was really worth. And finally, in first place, the doodlebug tractor crowned this list as the ultimate act of farmer defiance. the machine that made the whole implement industry look like a swindle. When a new tractor cost $1,000 or more, a sum a struggling farmer could only dream of, thousands of them simply built their own from a worn-out car. They cut down the frame of an old Model T, a Model A, or a junked truck, geared it down for pulling power, threw on lugged wheels or steel rims, and drove into the field on a tractor that had cost them $10 or $20 in parts. Mail-order companies even sold conversion kits for a few dollars, and farm magazines printed the plans. The doodlebug plowed, disked, hauled, and belted up to run the thresher and the buzzsaw, doing nearly everything the factory tractor did. It rattled, it overheated, it looked like something bolted together in the dark, and it saved the family farm through the hardest years the country ever knew. During the Depression and the war, when a new tractor was flat out of reach, the doodlebug kept America's fields turning. Oral histories are full of the pride of it. The old man who plowed 40 years on a machine he built from a wreck. The boys who learned to drive on a homemade rig their father welded in the barn. It was proof, loud and smoking and unmistakable, that the shiniest machine in the showroom was never the only way, and often not the smartest. The doodlebug did not just save money, it called the whole bluff. Across all 20, from the humble barrel roller to the defiant doodlebug tractor, these poor man's machines tell one story: that ingenuity beat the price tag every single time. Farmers with a junk pile and a welding torch built tools that plowed the same fields, pumped the same water, and put up the same hay as machines that cost a year's profit. The dealer's showroom sold shine and promises. The junk pile sold results. Which of these would you have built? Tell me in the comments, and if your grandfather owned a doodlebug, I want to hear about it.